Welcome to this second lecture on the philosophy of nonviolence. In this lecture, we'll be exploring the conceptions of justice and injustice that are foundational to the philosophy of nonviolence. As noted in the first lecture, there are 5 elements of the philosophy of nonviolence. In today's lecture, we will explore the nature of justice and injustice from the perspective of human dignity, equality, and freedom. The philosophy of nonviolence puts forth a particular conception of justice and injustice based in the foundations of dignity. Justice can be defined in general as what each person is due, that is, it is justified in claiming or demanding from a moral point of view, as well as what we owe others as matters of good and right, respectively. So justice refers to what each person is due or justified in claiming, and also, very importantly, what each person owes others from a moral perspective. Martin Luther King, in his letter from a Birmingham jail, asks, quote, "How does one determine whether a law is just or unjust? A just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God," end quote. For King and others, the moral law is the law of human dignity, equality, and freedom. So we could break this down into its 2 parts, into the 2 dimensions of justice, what each person is due and what we owe others. What each person is due from the perspective of human dignity is freedom and respect. We can conceive of what is due to each person in terms of what she values and is justified in claiming as necessary to realize a good life. So what each person is due is that which is fundamentally necessary for them to realize a good life, a life with dignity. And there are 2 very basic goods that are necessary for a good life, and that what each person as a possessor of equal inherent dignity is due and justified in claiming. That is respect. One is due respect as an end with intrinsic value, and also one is due as a fundamental good, freedom to do and to be what one has reason to value. Respect and freedom are fundamental goods that each person is due as a person with intrinsic value. In terms of what we owe others, from the perspective of human dignity, there is a very basic, universally binding moral obligation to respect persons as ends, respecting them as sources of agency and worth in their own right, with their own life plans to design and pursue. Martin Luther King argues from an overarching deontological but enforceable duty that in our hearts we grant thou-ness to other beings. This is an expression, thou-ness is an expression derived from the philosopher Martin Buber in his conception of human relations, authentic human relations, as I-thou relations, where one encounters the inherent subjectivity and value of other persons. So King is expressing an idea from Buber that we have a duty in our hearts to to respond to others and to treat others as thous rather than as objects, to treat them as subjects rather than objects. And this call for intrinsic value and dignity, the call of dignity, requires that we equally consider the good of others, that it requires the equal moral consideration of others as a basic matter of respect for them as persons, as ends. These two formulations of what we are due and what we owe others can be codified, can be expressed in terms of rights. And rights are justified, can be understood as justified claims to the actual enjoyment of some good. And dignity, from the perspective of dignity, entails this justified claim that all persons have or should be recognized as having certain rights within systems of rights. The public practice of rights must include, therefore, the right to vote, and the right to vote respects our deliberative capacity to make up our own minds in matters that concern us. That is an expression of personal freedom. That is, a right to freedom saves us from the indignity of submitting to the orders of others. And in a political sense, if we are not party to the formation of the law, if others define the law for us without representation, without participation, then we are obligated to follow laws that we had no part in enacting, and that's a fundamental assault of our dignity and an assault of respect. Therefore, we need to ensure the existence of democratic decision-making practices as well as institutions that are fully inclusive. So justice demands political and social institutions that include all persons as giving them moral standing and political standing to participate in decisions that affect their lives. This is a matter of justice. A just society, therefore, from the perspective of Martin Luther King, is the ultimate goal. It's to, quote, create a world where men and women can live together, and that goal requires agape, or love, kind of a brotherly love or sisterly love, as its foundation. We'll discuss the nature of agape later in our lecture on nonviolent resistance and its foundations. Martin Luther King often described a just society as a beloved community, and that beloved community entailed what his conception of integration as the welcome participation of African Americans and other groups as well. That is inclusion and participation in the total range of human, social, and political activities. That is, a just society is a hospitable and inclusive society. Full integration in America for King was concerned with equal and full participation in all its political and social institutions. So a just society is one that is inclusive and participatory on an equal basis. As we discussed a minute ago, freedom is a basic justified claim. We have a right to freedom as fundamental to our status as persons with dignity. However, freedom cannot merely be an abstract right, as King suggested. It has to be a concrete right. That is, individuals should be equipped with adequate material means so that they can take full advantage of their rights to freedom. King states, quote, Negroes must not only have the right to go into any establishment open to the public, but they must also be absorbed into our economic system in such a manner that they can afford to exercise that right. That is, abstract rights, in particular rights to liberty, codified in law, still without substantive material means, still allow second-class citizenship. The value of the rights of some is substantially greater because they have considerably more resources than others, which enables them to exercise these rights more effectively and across more social domains. In other words, freedom is hollow unless there are substantive social opportunities for its exercise. This is the idea expressed by John Rawls, American philosopher, of the fair value of liberty. Liberty requires not only freedom from coercive interference, but it requires the provision of social resources and opportunities necessary for its exercise. That is, one is not capable of pursuing what one has reason to value without the substantive social opportunity to exercise one's freedom. Therefore, freedom can be conceived as substantive. Its fair value needs to be guaranteed. And this requires distributive justice, the fair distribution of social goods and opportunities, including job opportunities and wealth. And this consideration of distributive justice expresses or connects to what we owe others, the second element of justice. The exercise of the fair value of freedom entails a relationship between citizens defined in terms of rights and obligation. For the provision of substantive social goods and opportunities necessary for the exercise of freedom requires that citizens acknowledge and affirm their duty to each other out of respect for each person's dignity. So that is conception of justice. Justice pertains to what we are due and what we owe others, and what we are due and owe others pertains to respect and freedom, as well as freedom, substantive freedom, or the fair value of liberty. This notion of this conceptualization of justice in the philosophy of nonviolence frames our understanding of what injustice entails from within that philosophical perspective. Martin Luther King writes, quote, an unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law. Any law that uplifts human personality is just. Any law that degrades human personality is unjust. The phenomenon of oppression and domination are unjust in the sense that they degrade the they degrade human personality, and thereby they violate the dignity of persons, thereby dehumanizing them. As King suggested, quote, to deprive man of freedom is to regulate him to the status of a thing rather than elevate him to the status of a person. An example of oppression and domination, that is, of injustice, is racial segregation. And this was a primary, the injustice of racial segregation was the primary concern of King's nonviolent philosophy and his movement that he was a part of, the civil rights movement. Segregation blocks the capacities of all persons to deliberate, choose, and take responsibility, because it imposes, quote, restraint on my deliberation as to what I shall do, where I shall live, how much I shall earn, the kind of tests I shall pursue, end quote. It has the consequence of forcing people to live in a system that is based upon decisions that I have not been party to. And therefore, segregation reduces certain persons, those who are discriminated against, into objects, into non-human status. Therefore, all segregation in law is unjust, because it distorts the soul and damages the personality from King's perspective. And it also imposes or implies a false sense of superiority onto those who are doing the segregation, and imposes a false sense of inferiority on those who are the objects of the segregation. That is, it turns segregation, to borrow Buber's idea again, creates an I-it relationship and distorts the possibility, or prevents the possibility, of I-thou respectful relations between persons. It regulates persons, or transforms them into things. An unjust law in this sense, including segregation, based upon the power of a majority group oppressing and dominating a minority group, is fundamentally a violation of the moral principle of reciprocity, that it compels a minority group to obey that which is not binding on the majority group, and therefore is unreciprocal. This is an example of injustice. In American history, there are two fundamental decisions relating to racial segregation and the status of African Americans in the United States. The Dred Scott decision of 1857, Supreme Court decision, which the court stipulated that the Negro, that is, the African American person, is not a citizen of the United States. He is merely property subject to the dictates of his owner. In law, the ownership of persons was established in slavery and reaffirmed in the Dred Scott decision of 1857, which led to the Civil War. In 1896, the Supreme Court case, Plessy versus Ferguson, the court reaffirmed or affirmed the legitimacy of what became known as racial segregation in the guise of Jim Crow, established a doctrine, Plessy established the doctrine of separate but equal as the law. And it became apparent that this segregation was enforced without any consideration of equality. And the court subsequently ruled in Board versus Brown, Brown versus the Board of Education, Brown versus the Board of Education, that segregation was inherently unequal. The Plessy doctrine resulted in wide-scale exploitation, oppression, and domination in American society, especially in the South. And Plessy and this racial segregation was a primary object of the nonviolent civil rights movement. In addition to racial segregation, a primary injustice in American society that the civil rights movement objected to and attempted to transform was the denial of the voting franchise. King wrote, quote, "The denial of the vote not only deprives the Negro of his constitutional rights, but what is even worse, it degrades him as a human being," end quote. Vote denial and segregation are injustices that reduced African Americans to things rather than persons. They cut off their capacity for freedom to deliberate, decide, and respond. Quote, "When I cannot choose what I shall do or where I shall live," King tells us, it means in fact that someone or some system has already made these decisions for me, and I am reduced to an animal, end quote. Racial segregation, discrimination, and vote denial essentially publicly mark persons within a socially stratified hierarchy as having lower and higher ranks, with persons of a high rank being conferred greater dignity, and therefore violating the basic value of equality. These unjust practices of segregation, discrimination, and vote denial were equivalent to what we could call bling laws in the Massachusetts Bay Colony in the 17th century. There were laws written that prohibited individuals of low rank from wearing various kinds of jewelry, whereas it gave persons of higher rank the license to wear jewelry, or what we could call today bling. And this marked what one was able to wear in public, marked certain persons of either a high or a low rank in the society, so-called bling laws. And one could argue that segregation and vote denial publicly marked African Americans and others as well, women, and other minorities, Native Americans, etc., as persons who were situated in the low end of a socially stratified hierarchy, thus violating their rights, violating their dignity, constituting a fundamental disrespect for their person. These processes were apparent in the phenomenon of colonization, in particular the European colonization of Asia and Africa, South America, that the colonized world is a world that's segregated and thus divided into the colonized and the colonizer. And colonialism is naked violence, the imposition of an external coercive power to dominate an indigenous population. And it's based upon a command conception of power. The segregation of the colonized and the colonizer is enforced through police and military power. And this takes place prominently in the British colonization of India, but throughout the world during the Age of Empire. And this is what colonization, in its dominating and oppressive nature, is what Gandhi is attempting to transform through nonviolent direct action and nonviolent resistance. To summarize, injustice is that which violates the dignity of human personality and thereby the basic moral imperative of respect for persons. And this takes the form of political domination and social oppression. In turn, justice requires a society, a beloved community, in King's words, that respects the dignity of all persons, manifested in systems of rights that guarantee moral, political, and social equality, as well as the fair value of freedom. Thank you very much.